Alright, having to remake this third video because the first one messed up. So anyway, we're talking about rock and roll. And during this time period, it's heavily infused by black and white culture. Taking these African rhythm and blues music and mixing in with white music. You have country, gospel, rhythm and blues, all kind of blending together early on. Rock and roll music is very impactful because it appeals to a lot of young people. So what you want to have down, just like you have with beat movement, that rock and roll itself is an act of rebellion, right? Rock and roll itself is an act of rebellion because most of the younger kids won't listen to it. Because it sings about things they care about. It sings about love mostly. Like that's what most pop songs are about today. That they sing about love and relationships. They sing about having cars, or having issues at school, or getting in fights, or just a lot of things that younger people care about, kind of like then and now, with rock and roll songs. Some of your most famous musicians of the 1950s are guys like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets, Elvis Presley, and you have Jerry Lee Lewis, who's also from Louisiana. These guys are all very big in the 1950s. So they all kind of blend their music. They all kind of different types of music. They do country, they do gospel and hymn type stuff. They do rock and roll. It all kinds of blends over itself early on. Plus, a lot of early rock and roll bands don't just use electrical instruments. They still use brass instruments. Like there's horns in some of these bands, and there's also like pianos and all kinds of other crazy stuff too. So rock and roll is this very new, unique version of music in the 1950s. But what you want to have down about this is that because it mostly appealed to young people, it was itself an act of rebellion. And even in spite of all the racism and everything else that took place, you could still access this music with radio and record players. So that's what you want to be aware of too, is that you could access this music and gain access to it with things like records and record players for cheap and radio. So even if you couldn't go to the concert, or if there's a racial segregation issue, whatever the case is, you can still access that music in those ways as well too. Okay, the racial gap. Many of rock and roll's best performers or earliest performers were African Americans, and they are often not allowed to go perform wherever they wanted to. They are often forced to play to segregated audiences or not at all. So some, like especially in the South, they may not even let African Americans come and do performances there. Or if they did, you would have like an all-white audience on the bottom floor and like African Americans in the balcony. And so that's a big challenge too. Should they go play for those kind of venues, or should they do more to fight for those kind of changes? But with radio and record players, African American musicians were able to reach larger audiences. So even without venues always letting them play, because of radio and because of other various ways to get music, like record players or friends' houses having music, whatever the case is, you had other ways to access this music. Some other earlier performers also struggled too, like Nat King Cole, Lena Horne, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie. Those are like jazz and blues singers that also very much struggle to get equal access and equal publicity because they're African American. The last thing we're gonna wrap up with for the weekend, and then I'll play you some rock and roll music when I get back on Monday because we didn't get to it in first hour either. I also want to talk about this one last thing, which is the other America, the white flight, inner cities, urban renewal projects. So we're going to address that real quick. So in the country at the time, even though you have 60% of Americans who are living in middle class, you still have a big chunk that are living in poverty. About 25% of Americans living in poverty, mostly in urban areas. So you have a lot of low-income people living in poverty in rural areas, especially like in cities. So rural areas, you have poverty a lot with whites, and then or to the south, there's a lot of blacks who live in rural areas who are in poverty. In a lot of the urban areas in America, like Detroit, New York, Chicago, Boston, a lot of the lower income folks can't afford to live in the suburbs, so they stay in the cities. So a lot of people who are lower income stay in the urban areas. And because a lot of those wealthier white people, middle class types, left the cities and brought all their tax revenue with them, it greatly hurts the cities too. So that's what you want to be aware of, that even though you have a lot of Americans living in middle class suburban neighborhoods, about 60% of Americans who are middle class and live in suburban areas, you still have about 25% of Americans who are living in poverty, whether it be the urban area or it be the rural area for black, white, or even Latinos who live in rural areas and live in poverty in the Southwest. And so a lot of Americans aren't really aware of this. If you live in the suburbs, you're not really traveling to go see all this on a daily basis. So they're not always aware of the slum areas these people are living in or the desperate rural conditions these people are living in general. But about 50 million Americans were living in poverty by this time period. One cause of this is white flight. Because white Americans had greater opportunities at jobs or education, it means it's easier for them to get out of the working class or lower income classes and into middle class, which means it's easier for them to eventually get money to get out of the cities and move to suburbs. So if there's a perceived notion like a city is being run down or is being overtaken by minorities, a lot of whites will, if they had the money, leave the area. And that happens a lot in history where you see cities evacuated by a lot of whites. That happened in Baton Rouge for a long time. There were thousands of people in Baton Rouge who began to move to places like Zachary or Central, Denham Springs, or Gonzales or Prairieville. They live in those areas, but they commute to Baton Rouge because they don't want to live in those areas. They don't want to live in Baton Rouge. And so, if there's this perceived notion that that areas are getting run down or falling apart or not as good, you have a lot of white people who usually have more money who are able to leave those areas, and it causes this phenomenon called white flight. I mean, you could even say that happened in Zachary at some point if there's a perception that a lot of minorities or African Americans or other groups come into our city and begin to overrun the city, or they become too dominant in the school system. And so whites then begin to pull their kids out of the schools and go other places or go to other parts of neighboring communities. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Instead of trying to stay and fix the problems that you have, you just leave the area, thus making it more minorities and having whites leave the area as well too. So just be aware that this is becoming a growing problem with white flight. Thousands of white Americans are leaving with their tax dollars. They're leaving with their tax money that would help benefit those areas whenever they leave these areas. Because it hurts education and roads and transportation and police and fire and all that within the cities when they take that revenue away. Lastly, you have inner cities. Many suburbanites were just unaware of the poverty in cities. Whites leaving took away revenue and political influence in government, and so the services and the quality of the cities left behind start to fall apart. Like you don't have as much removal of garbage, or you have bad street repair. You also get rising crime. But if whites living in suburbs aren't aware of this and they drive around it or they don't drive by it, they're not aware of this issue. So what you kind of want to have down for this last little bit of this section is that Americans are not really much aware of the poverty problems that we have at the time because of all the prosperity we have in the 1950s. But in the 1960s, you will see the governments under Kennedy and Johnson try to address this more. So that's what you want to kind of be aware of now, that in the 60s, we begin to kind of address this poverty issue more. We're going to talk about it in the next unit, Unit 8. So just kind of be aware of that right now. The poverty issue is going on, but many Americans are unaware of the problems in inner cities because they don't go there. Inner cities being these, older parts of town that are more run down and usually crowded with a lot of low-income people. So they're going to try to address that issue more in the 60s, but we're just not there yet. For urban renewal projects, just be aware that there is some help from the government to try to start doing urban renewal, whether it be state or local or national. They're giving money and funding to try to destroy older parts of town, slum areas that are run down or old-looking or need to be replaced. And they're trying to make different parts of cities better by building parks or building better apartments or building something that people would attract new people to come to. It has good and negative effects. It does make the area better by doing these urban renewal projects, by bulldozing old buildings down. But the negative effect of this is that the poor maybe can't afford it and they're still forced to go somewhere else. So it doesn't really solve the problem of being poor. So unless you're building housing for poor people, sometimes those renewal projects don't really benefit the poor directly because it just kind of forces them to go somewhere else. All right, we're going to stop there. Have a good weekend. I don't know if I said this earlier, but we are going to test on Unit 7 next Thursday and Friday. So Kahoot review will be on Wednesday, next Thursday and Friday before Mardi Gras will be the test.